let's get started. Welcome to this session about how to remove corporate emissions with CORCs, and CORCs refer to CO2 removal certificates. In this session, we are going to first define what is carbon removal, and that will be done by Marianne Tikkanen, the other co-founder of Puro. I will be then talking about what is Puro and how what are these CO2 removal certificates. Then Joona will be talking about the SBTi guidance to net zero, and then we have a guest speaker from the footprint firm Mikkel talking about how to calculate companies' carbon footprint. And there's some noise coming from somewhere. Can you perhaps mute your microphone? There we go. All right. We have the guest of honor, Stacey Kauk from Shopify, talking about their approach to carbon removals. How did you select what you selected, and key learnings from that quite intensive work that you did. And then we are going to talk about the actual how it is possible to purchase these CORCs, and then also look at the way forward, the roadmap to megaton scale. And that will be discussed by myself and Marianne. And at the end of it, hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A session. So feel free to post your questions to the chat, and Elba from Puro team will be then reviewing those questions and serving them to our speakers and others to be discussed. Okay, so let's move on. And before we go to the point of what is carbon removal, let me just remind that the reason why we are here is the fact that the CO2 concentration levels have been rising steadily throughout the decades. And even though there was a lockdown in most parts of the world in early 2020, you can't really see that in these curves. The CO2 concentration keeps on growing, and that is the cause for climate change. So in order to curb that rise, we need to start removing it from there. And of course, scientists agree on that. Some companies have already started to act on that. Shopify is a great example. Microsoft, of course, there as well. And now we're seeing that there's a huge new business starting to grow and around carbon removals. So Marianne, why don't you discuss then what is carbon removal altogether? I can't hear you. Can you make sure that you are?
Need to do it with the computer. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Indeed. Go ahead.
So if you take the next slide, please. Yesterday we had the presentation or webinars about our new methodology, carbon removed into geological storages, and there Bellona presented the 4 principles of what is carbon removal. I very much liked their way of putting it into 4 clear rules, so I am going to use the same. And Bellona is an NGO, non-profit organization that has been working with the in environmental issues for more than 20 years. So principle number 1, the carbon dioxide has to be physically removed from the atmosphere. Principle number 2, the removed carbon dioxide has to be stored in a manner intended to be permanent. Principle number 3 is the emission balance, that you have to account all the emissions of the process before and after, so upstream and downstream emissions associated with the carbon removal have to be included in the emission balance. And principle number 4, this carbon balance has to be net negative. As it is put here, carbon dioxide removed has to be greater than carbon dioxide emitted. And with these 4 principles, if all of them are true or all of them are fulfilled, then that is genuine carbon dioxide removal. And it is widely accepted that carbon is physically removed from atmosphere with these 3 mechanisms. One is the biomass. Through photosynthesis, when it grows, it captures atmospheric CO2. One is oceans. Every year, a big part of the atmospheric anthropogenic CO2 that we emit to the atmosphere is dissolved in the oceans, and that is making oceans acid. And then there is the direct air capture, where engineered machines capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. What is not physically removed from atmosphere when it comes to carbon dioxide is the fossil path, that removing fossil carbon dioxide is returning it back to the fossil reservoir, not a genuine carbon removal. So what happens between the long-term storage and the capture phase is often grouped into 2 groups, engineered removals, where Puro has started our carbon removal journey, and nature-based removals, and quite often a blended, where both are present in some phases. Let's look at those. So here I've made a durability, storage durability graph starting from 1 year and going all the way to the geological storage of 10,000 years. And yesterday we were proud to announce this new methodology into Puro family, geologically removed carbon, and this presents what happens there. So there you take biogenic CO2 or direct air captured CO2 and put it in the geological storage. And this is a very permanent way of storing or removing carbon dioxide. Then there is the other extreme, a very short term, with the exactly same ingredients, taking biomass, taking direct air captured carbon dioxide. You could make fuels, plastics, packaging, and other very short term products. They do present carbon removal or carbon storage, but the permanence and durability is very short. Typically, they are returned back to atmosphere in less than a year or less than 10 years. So is there something in between these 2 extremes? And to cut the long story short, there is plenty of things that do remove and store carbon in between the 1 year and the 10,000 years. For example, the biochar, which is a way to alter the biomass so that it does not decompose. So the decaying of the biomass is stopped through a process called pyrolysis. There are other soil amendment types where the decaying is also stopped with different means. Biomass in building materials or roads or infrastructure around us is also a way to store biomass in meaningfully long times when you look at the climate impact. So carbon is present around us in very many forms, and in very many forms by engineering it we can make it stay there longer. So we can divide this into based on the durability on consumables or short-term carbon capture and usage type of storages, and then durables where the carbon is removed and stored for longer periods or even permanently in the geological storage. And then it is something what I as an engineer can call a multivariable optimization problem. There are extremes of durability. There are also very big differences in availability, what is available now, what has to be built, and also the affordability. And then it's a question of different optimization criteria and what you want to do, what is the most important, what can come second. And Microsoft stated in their recent white paper that they are focused on getting as much, as quickly out of the atmosphere as much carbon as they can get and keeping it there as long as possible. So those are basically the variables that we have to play with. And in summary, with carbon removal in the context of Puro.earth, we mean carbon dioxide that is physically removed from the atmosphere. It is net of any life cycle process emissions, and it is stored for long term.
All right. Now, thank you very much. So I would actually request all that are not presenting to turn off their videos. I think there's, it works better for everybody if we just turn on the video when needed. Thank you very much. All right. So moving on, this is now the section where we talk a little bit about Puro, who we are, and so forth. So Puro is first and foremost a carbon removal standard that specializes in the engineered carbon removal. Secondly, we also run a registry where the integrity and the life cycle management is done for the certificates that we issue based on the standard. So the standard consists of multiple methodologies, and now we are also working together with this ever-growing ecosystem on new methodologies. We also enable other types of innovation, how, for example, companies can become even more net negative, or the suppliers, and so forth. And fourth, we are, and perhaps the most visible part of it is the B2b Marketplace, where the CORCs, or the CO2 removal certificates, are traded, or the buyers can get access to the certificates in order to achieve their ambitious climate goals. In addition to that, we are also working on a concept called Comprehensive Carbon Removal Funding Framework, which consists of 3 elements. So It's there's first one of them is pre-CORC, which is a instrument that denotes basically future issuance of CORCs. And it's basically a structured way to do long-term offtake agreements. Secondly, we are working on a fund that will provide equity for growth for these new facilities to be built. And third, there's going to be a global network of lenders that will complete the funding for these facilities. So more about that later. So this presentation is not about that, but everything that is inside the circle. So here's our team. At the moment, we're a compact team of 8 persons. Actually, our newest recruit is missing from this picture. And if you'd like to join our team, please do send an email to recruitment@Puro.earth. So first of all, it's good to highlight the fact that emission reductions are essential. They are our own responsibility. That is not something that can be outsourced to anybody else. Our job is to find and verify net negative carbon emissions, or let's say operations that are carbon net negative. All the methodologies that we have are science-based, and quantification is based on measuring and not modeling. This is very important to minimize the margin of error. And of course, the end result that we are aiming for is that these technologies that we have identified get the fuel for growth. So that this business model that we have employed that allows the monetization of the negative emissions accelerates the growth of these net negative industries. There it is in a nutshell. And if we look at the the mechanics of our sort of thinking, you'll note that there's a product or a material that is coming from the conveyor belt, and of course, in the production of such any material or product, there are some emissions. So we look at the emissions according to the ISO 14064 LCA, or Life Cycle Assessment Standard, and then that is compared with the embodied carbon of that product. And if it is more, if the embodied carbon or the removed carbon is more than the emissions were, then there is a net negative part, which can be turned into something we call CO2 removal certificate, or a CORC. That is the digital tradable asset we are talking about here today. The physical product can be sold as carbon neutral in order to avoid double sales. And here is an image of a audit statement that is done by an independent third party. Here we have a couple of partners. DNV GL is one of them, and a very distinguished company, has 130 years of history and is well equipped to estimate the eligibility of the facilities within these methodologies. So once we get this document from after the site visit and everything has been verified, we can issue the certificates that are then available for trading. And here are our 4 current methodologies. Biochar is a very stable form of carbon. It is made from biomass, and if it is used as soil amendment, it stays in the soil for hundreds or thousands of years. Carbonate building elements are, it's like concrete, but made entirely without cement. It's made from steel slag, and it's carbonated, so exposed to high concentration of CO2, and thus becomes carbon net negative. Wooden building elements are a very good way to make use of the biomass that is growing in the forests by building wooden structures or structures of houses from that. It stays there for a long period of time, locked away from circulation. And finally, geologically removed carbon is the one that Marianne referred to. That new methodology was launched yesterday. And it is basically biogenic or atmospheric CO2 that is taken away from circulation by storing it underground in a geologic formation. But this is not the end of it, of course. There are still new methodologies coming up. Soil amendments, maybe something forestry related, mineralization, blue carbon, a lot of new innovation happening all around the globe, and we are tapping into that very actively. So we have a couple of customers displayed here who have trusted us, and Microsoft, of course, being there. Shopify, one of our speakers today, is there as well. And just wanted to highlight that in the case of Microsoft, the most recent one of these, they published their portfolio, what they bought, and the five, top most sort of bottom ones are all engineered carbon CDR or carbon dioxide removal, and 3 out of the 5 were through Puro. And now that we've launched the new methodology, the 2 others, bioenergy and direct air capture, would be feasible to join our ecosystem as well. Okay, now I think it's time to let Joona take the stage and talk about SBTi's guidance to net zero. He's our sales manager and a rising star of the carbon removal scheme.
Yeah, I was going to say I did not write that myself, but thank you to whoever did. So. All right, so without further introduction, so yeah, Joona Kunnas. I've been at Puro since last May. Work as a sales manager, so kind of everything related to the demand side of the marketplace. That's something that I, together with Antti, work on, and I'll work with a lot of our corporate customers. So what I want to kind of talk about today briefly is that current market and what we're seeing developing in the space of carbon removal and carbon net zero commitments, and then discuss briefly some observations from the Science-Based Target Initiative that have now come out with their guidance to net zero target setting for corporations. So arguably, the net zero commitments is what are really driving the carbon removal market. So I think that's a logical place to start. What we're currently seeing with a lot of these companies is that while it's awesome that there are so many of these net zero commitments and a lot of action already and a lot of talk around it, but in some cases, the pressure to make this commitment comes from the top, the stakeholders and the management. And the sustainability team is kind of left to figure it out by themselves, which is fine. But I'm sure there's even some sustainability people in the audience today that kind of feel the pain. And that's just want to say that we're all here kind of working together and trying to help everyone else out. Because at the moment, it's not so clear as to what does net zero exactly mean. And that is why these NGOs, such as Science-Based Targets, it's imperative that they come out with the guidance and the rules on what to do. And then I think the same goes with understanding the market of what is out there in terms of carbon removal and what is a credible carbon offset, and how can all of these be implemented into these net zero pledges and plans when it is time to act. And there's actually a kind of a funny article by Carbon Direct kind of describing the pain of the sustainability teams right now when they just get told to do something, and it's pretty much just, okay, you guys got to figure it out. So tell me when it's done. So yeah, just want to say that there's a lot of experts and a lot of knowledge out there right now working on this matter. So these net zero commitments are actually possible to achieve at some point. So this is a very awesome post that I came upon last week, and I think it says it pretty well. So let's not just do something that we think we should do, but everything that we do and these net zero targets have to be aligned and, you know, make sense. They have to be aligned with climate science and not just based on what we think we should do. And I think this is imperative from the very beginning to establish, kind of getting the feel of what some corporations are doing. And then in some cases, it's not a lie to say that it has been in the past kind of not commonly understood. As an example, when Microsoft says we're planning to be carbon net negative, well, what does that exactly mean? Yes, now today there's a lot of public data available, all of their explanations, everything's transparent. So I think I just want to emphasize on the fact that the research needs to be done at the same time. So what I just said, while it's really encouraging to see a lot of these net zero commitments, there's clearly need for the standard for net zero, which Science-Based Targets Initiative is now currently developing. And this criteria is actually still out for the public consultation by the end of next week. So I think everyone involved in the space who wants to have a say, it's important to go read out the document, kind of see what still needs to be improved, what could be discussed, and submit your comment. I believe it's open until the 26th. So you still have one more week to do that. So I just want to quickly discuss some of the observations from this criteria that is already out and currently being developed. So first and foremost, calculating the emissions, setting reduction targets, and creating a plan how to make these reduction happen. That is and will be the most critical thing, and critical climate action to take on. So then, secondly, what is being suggested now is that the decarbonization should happen within your own business model and in your own value chain. And I think here's one key element that can be taken out of this that's very important for going forward. Net zero means that it is not possible to outsource the emission reductions to somebody else. And this is that we've seen in the past way of thinking and in the past carbon offsetting market, where it is okay to pay for somebody else to do something and reduce their emissions, but that is not net zero aligned going forward. So the question remains, there's still business models and companies that will always have some sort of emission. It's just simply impossible to decarbonize everything through, so what to do with the residual emissions. And this is something that, according to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the avoidance and reduction-based offset credits are no longer eligible in order to achieve these net zero targets. And this is exactly where the verified carbon removal comes in. This graph shown here is part of the criteria and draft introduced by SBTI right now. So what does then mean? What is net zero aligned carbon dioxide removal? And what are the requirements and characteristics that are currently being discussed in this market? It's not just SBTI. There's a lot of good research being done right now. This publication by the University of Oxford is very good as well, and we see a lot of these characteristics play very well into carbon removal, and something that we are suggesting in what we're doing. But again, it's very important that the research is being done not just by one or a few NGOs or companies, that it is a common understanding and a set rule of guidelines, at least at the suggested level. So net zero aligned removal has to provide a storage for the CO2. And this is needed so that the carbon removal effect can have a guaranteed permanence. In some cases, the physical carbon leakage needs to be secure somehow. So something that goes with that is that they are suggesting that there needs to be a buffer. Some cases, the carbon removal can be based on modeling, where there's going to be a lot of potential for risks. But even in that case, and especially in our case as well, there needs to be a buffer created. And that is something that in all Puro.earth methodologies, this buffer for potential leakage for the years coming is already taken under consideration. Ex post requirement is to minimize the margin of error, and at the same time, it is so that these credits can be uniquely matched to neutralize an X amount of these unique emissions. Since the emissions already happened, and we know the exact amount, we should also know the exact amount of carbon that is being removed. And that is why we're seeing a lot of talk about this preference and transition to the ex post requirement for these credits. Third-party verification, very important. That's something that's being talked a lot. And the fact that all of these project developers, the projects, the carbon removal, the whole process is being monitored, not just by the project developer or the buyer, the corporate buyer, but that there's somebody in between that, and then maybe even other players monitoring that to making sure that it is truly happening and all the rules are compliant. Vintage limited to 3 years. This is something that is currently being suggested as well by the SBTi. And what that means, if it's not evident to some, it means that from the issuing date of the carbon sequestration, the credit can only live until 3 years, and it needs to be canceled or retired within those 3 years. As of right now, in the traditional offset market, sometimes we see credits of something of a project that happened 10 years ago, while it is still possible for a company to claim those credits and claim the Climate Act. And that is now being suggested that that cannot happen if it's a net zero aligned removal act. And the final thing, best solutions available today, meaning that the final criteria is still being developed, and it's imperative that we don't just wait for these policymakers to come up with these rules and wait around for things to happen. That now is the time to act. To all companies, whether you're already buying offsets, make sure you're buying the most credible offsets that are currently out of the market. We need to be using these mitigation strategies that already exist, taking advantage of them. And then at the same time, let's not wait for the best carbon removal act or set of guidelines to come in. We now see that there's a tremendous amount of research being done by companies, by NGOs, by everyone. And here it is. It's pretty plain and simple what is necessary and what is good for the climate. So while it doesn't make sense to wait around let's say, if you think that direct air capture is the best way of going forward, but it's going to take 10 years for it to develop to the level that you need to purchase these credits from. No, start with a small amount, implement it into your portfolio, and start growing that business. Start growing the Climate Act, the negative emission technologies, to send the demand signal to these carbon removers, and in some cases in these startups. Obviously, there's a lot of action already happening in the net zero and carbon removal space. To this, we can thank companies like Microsoft, Shopify, Swiss Re, Stripe, and there's a lot of other companies and pioneers in the space that are already starting to see the value, see the potential, and see how important it is to start the action today. And yeah, overall, I see the future for carbon removal and for the year 2020 being very fruitful, and really looking forward to it. That's all that I had for today.
Thank you, Joona. So next up is Mikkel. His presentation on how to calculate carbon footprint. And That is a wide topic, and unfortunately we have allocated quite limited time to Mikkel. So good luck, Mikkel, in trying to squeeze a lot of information and insight into this rather short period.
Thank you so much, Antti, and thanks to all of you from Puro for having me on this webinar. It's a very interesting topic. So I'm going to speak the next 10 minutes about how to calculate a company's carbon footprint. And before I get started with that, I'm just going to share with you that I'm from a company called the Footprint Firm. We're a Danish-based sustainability-only company, basically advising companies on their CO2 emissions, amongst other things, and then investing in sustainable startups. And as Antti said, I'm going to speak 10 minutes about this rather broad topic. And if you do have questions afterwards, feel free to reach out. But here's the introduction at least. I'm going to speak about what emissions to include, then how emissions are quantified, and then very briefly in the end touch upon how we can reduce emissions. And basically it's going to be structured around these 7 steps. And if we just started by the first, so what emissions should be included? Basically, there are 2 steps here. First, define the scope of the baseline, and second, to select which scope 3 categories to include. We start with step 1, defining the scope of the baseline. Is really what is being defined as defining the organizational boundary. And here you have 2 approaches. You can either do the equity share approach, or you could do the control approach. The equity share approach is really that it is the equity share of a certain subsidiary of a company that determines how much of the CO2 emission the company should account for. So if a company owns 75% of a subsidiary, it will only take 75% of the emissions to consolidate on the company level. The control approach is basically saying that a company accounts for 100% of the CO2 emissions from the operations or which it has control over. So if the same company has control over this subsidiary, then it will consolidate 100% of the emissions from the company, or at the company level from the subsidiary. So this is the first step of defining which subsidiaries are we covering with our baseline, and how are we consolidating these subsidiary emissions. Second, you go into the operational boundary setting, which is really selecting the scope 3 categories to include. And for those of you not knowing, then scope 1 to 3 is basically the GHG protocol's way of defining how you measure CO2. And I think it's the most commonly used framework for measuring CO2 baselines worldwide. But the GHG protocol basically uses 3 scopes. The first scope is what they call direct emissions. So that's the emissions stemming from your company's production facilities, the machines that are in your company, and it's from the company vehicles, so company cars, trucks, etc. It's basically the fuel that you as a company yourself is burning up into the atmosphere, so to speak. Then you have scope 2, which is one of the indirect emission factors or emission sources, and basically it's all the utilities that you buy from your utility companies. So if you're an office-based company, it's the heating and electricity going into your office. If you're a big production site, then it's again the electricity and heating, cooling, and so forth that you are buying, steam that you're buying to run your operations. So those are the 2 first scopes, and probably the easiest ones to get your head around, and also the ones that are actually mandatory, at least for larger companies, to measure and report on. The tricky part really comes on the scope 3 emissions, which are divided into upstream and downstream categories. And here you have 15 categories that basically sums up the emissions from your entire value stream, both going into your operation. So that might be the goods and services, the capital goods that you're purchasing, the transport, it's the travel that you have, your employees have. And then downstream you have what goes out of your business. So if you're selling equipment used by some other production side, then it has an emission. If you sell electronic equipment that uses electricity, then it causes an emission, and so forth. Different categories to measure the total footprint from your value chain. And scope 3 is not mandatory but optional to include. So this step is really around selecting which categories should we then focus on, which are the material one for us, and that will vary very much from company to company and sector to sector. And I think, just to put it in perspective, on general, scope 3 emissions are around 7 times higher than scope 1 and 2 emissions. Like overall, that will of course vary from company to company, but it just tells you that the scope 3 emissions are often where the big emissions lay, and thus becomes a focus for a lot of companies. So that's basically the 2 steps of selecting which emissions to include. Then the next step is to start quantifying emissions, and that goes through. We normally do this through 4 steps. First, you define how do you collect data. Then you go out and collect the data from your organization and suppliers. Then you find emission factors, and then you do the calculation of the baseline. If you start with defining the data collection approach, you can basically take 2 approaches, a spend-based or an activity-based data approach. The spend-based approach is basically taking all your spends on goods, transport, travel, etc., and then multiplying them by an emission factor. This is the good thing about this way of this data, is that it gives you a quick calculation method. If you don't have knowledge of the specific materials of type of products, and it can give you a broad overview of your CO2 emissions. So normally we'll first do a spend-based baseline to figure out which.
All right, there was a breakup.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry. But the slides are not visible.
I'll just get them back on screen. So can you see my screen again? Yes. So sorry for that. The disadvantages of only using a spend-based approach is really that it's unprecise and it's difficult to use strategically, as you can only reduce your emissions by reducing spend, so to speak. So normally we suggest it as a first step for the scope 3 emissions to use the spend-based approach. The activity-based approach then goes into another set of data sources, which is basically items purchased or consumed. For instance, the liter of gasoline, the kilowatt hours of electricity, the units you purchased of electronic equipment or whatever, the kilometer you have traveled, and then you multiply these activities by an emission factor. And that gives a more precise CO2 calculation. It gives a possibility to work more strategically with your emissions, but it also takes some higher demands into the data quality and takes a lot of or more effort to collect the data. So we normally suggest that you always use the activity-based data for scope 1 and 2, and then for the important scope 3 categories, you can kind of refine the spend-based approach with the activity data. The 4th step is then really to start collecting your data, and very overall, you collect your spend data, so your OPEX and CAPEX from your general ledger or whatever, and you start collecting these material amounts. So that might be the liters of fuel from your company cars, it might be the kilowatt hours of electricity and heating. You might reach out to your travel agency to get the amounts of kilometers for flights, etc., etc. The 5th step is then to find the right emission factors. And an emission factor is the factor that you multiply by either the spend or the material amount. And the emission factor databases are actually out there and publicly available. If you look at scope 1 and 2, then in general you have quite good access to good emission factors. So DEFRA is an open source, annually updated source, which is really good for scope 1. And the IEA also has an updated annually updated source for electricity and heating emissions, which you can pay for access to. In scope 3, it's a bit different. In general, the emission factors are better for the activity-based calculations than for the spend-based calculations. An activity-based emission factor will, for instance, be the kilo of wood that you used for producing a product, or the number of chairs that you produced. And you take this activity-based amount and multiply it by an emission factor that could be found within some of these sources shown here. The spend-based emission factors can also be used. They carry a bit less accuracy and are not as often updated. But you can use them, but be aware that you need to correct for inflation, that you need to be consistent in how you treat the VAT and stuff like that. So after completing these steps, you basically have the inputs that you need to calculate your CO2 baseline, and it will really be in the end, it is quite simple calculation of the unit with the correct emission factor. So those are the steps for calculating the baseline. And I think a final remark is that it's important to stress that right now, scope 3 emissions estimates are not exact science. I mean, there are a lot of complexity in a lot of businesses' value chains, which makes it hard to get the data that you want to get. And furthermore, the emission factors are not yet perfect. So the solution here and the mindset should be that sometimes you need to use proxies and calculate your way a bit through, and that's of course not perfect, but it's the best that you sometimes can do depending on the data. But you should always be transparent on your method and open and have that open to scrutiny. Finally, just a very brief comment on how to reduce emissions, and we tend to structure this around a reduction hierarchy. So it's only to say that you want to first, once you've calculated your baseline, look at where are activities which are carbon intensive that we can actually completely avoid. Then you might look at other activities which has a high carbon, use high carbon materials or energy, and try to substitute them or replace them with low carbon alternatives. You can also look at efficiency levers for reducing, and then finally, at some point, you will get up to a point where you cannot eliminate any more emissions, and that's where you, of course, start looking into emission removals. So yes, that was the words from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mikkel. That was very well done. And now it would be the turn of Stacy from Shopify. Would you, Stacy, want to share your slides yourself, or shall I do that from here?
I think it would be best if you did, Antti. It'd be smoother.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Wonderful. It's so nice to be here, and thanks so much to the Puro team for the invitation to share a little bit more about Shopify's approach. For those that may not know, Shopify is a leading global commerce company. We provide trusted tools to start, grow, market, and manage a retail business of any size. I want to focus today on our process that we use to buy carbon removal. Mikkel did a wonderful job of talking about the measuring and reductions approach, and today I'll focus on the removal approach. So back in the fall of 2019, we can move to the next slide, Shopify launched our sustainability fund. This was a $5 million annual commitment to spend $5 million on the most promising solutions and technologies to fight climate change. We also set a $1 million minimum that must be allocated towards carbon sequestration. And for us, that meant atmospheric CO2 that is then permanently stored and locked away. And 2020 was our first year. And so we can move to the next slide. And I joined Shopify at the beginning of 2020 to start building out our program for the fund. And I began building out a network, trying to connect with as many people in this space as possible. And the first thing that I realized was that we're going to need every possible solution. We're going to need everything that's available today, and we're going to need everything that's available tomorrow in the future if we are going to have a shot at reversing climate change. And so that was the founding principle for our fund. So we didn't limit ourselves to only engineered solutions or only nature-based solutions. We wanted to find a way to support companies across a wide range of verticals. And there were a couple reasons behind that. One, obviously, we were founding it on that principle of wanting to support all the solutions, but it was also because we recognized that there wasn't going to be a clear path forward. All of these solutions are going to need support right now so that we can figure out and identify which are the best ones that are going to scale and really move us forward towards our target of decarbonization. And another founding principle for our fund was we recognized that a lot of what was available was either not commercially ready, or if it was commercially available, it's also really expensive. So we also made a commitment that we were comfortable with overpaying. So we can move to the next slide. So those were the founding principles for our fund. And what we decided to do for our selection process, because I joined at the end of January 2020, we only had about 8 or 9 months to get rolling, and we wanted to make sure that we moved our $5 million that year. We decided to do a closed targeted request for proposal process where we would operate on an invite-only basis to invite carbon removal companies to provide us with information so that we could determine how much we'd be willing to pay and how much we wanted to buy. And what we did was we focused on three criteria, and one was the life cycle analysis of the project today. And also, we wanted to understand the future life cycle analysis. When that technology or solution has scaled, what is the life cycle analysis at that point? Because often these early stage companies are conducting research. They can be quite carbon intensive, especially some of the engineered solutions, and they rely heavily on the electricity supply in terms of having renewable energy available to power their systems, which then gives them a much better net carbon negative assessment. When you're doing research and you're doing small quantities, for example, it may not be practical to site your facility to get that low carbon intensity power. But at scale, if you were to site that facility in a place or build, a solar array so that you can have 100% renewable energy, that net carbon negativity of that technology could be significantly larger at scale. So we wanted to understand both the picture of the life cycle analysis now and what was the potential for carbon negativity at scale. The second piece that we focused on was the solution's ability to scale. We didn't want to go out and support solutions that would only contribute a small amount of carbon removal once they scale. We wanted to go out and support technologies and solutions that, if they're successful, if they get the capital that they need to scale, and their research comes back and shows that, yes, this is a viable solution, and when they start to scale, they'll actually form a major part of the climate solution. So we really wanted, megaton, gigaton potential for the companies that we were going to support. The other part is the cost. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the solutions that are available now are very expensive because companies have a higher price point right now that once they begin to scale, that cost curve is going to come down. And we really wanted to identify technologies that once they scale, the price point would come down, perhaps to $100 per ton, when right now it could be upwards of $800 per ton. But at scale, the price point is accessible for many other companies to buy that carbon removal. In addition to the economics and the carbon negativity, we also wanted to make sure that we had a solid understanding of the science behind the process and to understand the gaps in research, because a lot of the solutions that are out there are working to enhance existing nature-based solutions or work with nature. So we wouldn't want to support a solution that could have negative environmental impacts, not necessarily on climate, but on biodiversity or habitat, things like that. So we really wanted to understand the do no harm and what potential co-benefits there would be of the project. So that was our selection process and criteria. And we can move to the next slide. And so what we have on our next slide is the way that we decided to group our companies. We have companies that, I'm not sure, my slide's not updating. Is it updating for others?
I did change that slide.
Wonderful.
No,
there's a bit of a delay in my connection, so I apologize if I'm not aligned. So what we ended up doing for 2020, we developed our Frontier portfolio and our Evergreen portfolio. We made purchases from 13 companies that fall into these categories. With Puro, we made purchases from 3 biomass companies, so they're biochar companies, which was very exciting for us because we see such potential in that area. And how we grouped our companies in our Frontier portfolio, these are the solutions and technologies that right now need support because they're not quite proven. Some of the technology or science needs to be de-risked, and then these solutions need to be scaled to bring the cost down. Our Evergreen portfolio is where we are supporting solutions that are available now, and they often provide either temporary storage, so we're not talking storage beyond 100 years, we're talking less than that, or it's a project-based approach where you're not able to confirm that you've locked your molecules of CO2 away. What you're doing is managing a project so that you're maintaining a carbon sink over the span of the project. So that's our Evergreen portfolio. And we can go to the next slide. And so in the Frontier portfolio and our Evergreen portfolios have our 2 different types of companies. And what we decided to do was, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach for these companies, we wanted to be flexible because each company has different technology, a different solution. They're at a different point in the development of their business. So in some cases, we've decided to overpay to support research, to help companies set up pilot scale testing, and to experiment so that they can develop their proof of concept. So how we designed it is, so our sustainability fund is a capital expenditure fund. We don't take equity in the companies. What we will do is overpay to provide additional revenue for these companies so that they can then invest that in de-risking their technology and their approach, buy a new filter, do all sorts of different things that they need at their plant in order to continue their operations and scale. So we have a wide range of deals. We have some that are as small as $25,000. We have others that are multi-year deals that are well over $3 million. So what we've tried to do is use our purchase as a demand signal that those companies can then use to get access to additional capital and financing to move their solutions forward. So we took a flexible approach to meet each company where they were at so that we could do more than just make a purchase and be their customer. What we wanted to do was be more than that and really provide additional value than just the money we were providing. So on the next slide, I'm going to share with our early insights from year one, because 2020 was our first $5 million fund. Right now, we're moving into our second year with our new $5 million to spend. And last year, we learned a few things. And what we're learning is that because of the purchases made by Shopify, Microsoft, and other companies, the demand is starting to happen for buying carbon removal. And what that's done is money is flowing into these companies. They're starting to scale. They're increasing their supply. They're now able to provide more carbon removal to the market. And what they need is more buyers, because they're starting to get that momentum, and we need to turn that flywheel over, which we've just started to push with our initial purchases, but now we need to get more buyers on board to really get the market going. And our second insight from our first year, and this really will support having more buyers join, is that standard methodologies like those that are being developed by Puro will help lower the perceived risk of these new types of solutions and these new storage mechanisms. And what a lot of companies that I speak with talk about is, well, if it's not a verified or third-party verified carbon credit, or if there's no standard methodology, they're not comfortable making that purchase and to apply that as a removal against their corporate footprint. So we really need to accelerate the development and adoption of these standard methodologies. And, you know, while that's happening, what we want to do, and this echoes what Una was saying earlier, is that we need to have emerging technologies included in corporate climate programs, and this will then build the industry for the future. We don't want to get stuck in that emission measurement reduction cycle, but oh, that solution's really expensive, so I can't allocate it. And you end up in an accounting situation where you have a certain budget, you have a certain amount of emissions, and this drives us to spend to the lowest price point, which means some of the best solutions that just need support to scale are not being supported. So what we're talking about doing, not necessarily at Shopify, because we've already set up our fund. We have our $5 million that we spend every year on this, but is to encourage other companies to set aside a little bit, even just, you know, $10,000 to spend on something that is an emerging technology, to have a little bit of money that's set aside that you play with, that you experiment with to support these companies. And that brings me to my last slide. And it is about that risk. And it is about having some money to put behind emerging carbon removal solutions, because we recognize that of the 13 companies we decided to support in 2020, we obviously hope that all of their technologies and solutions de-risk, their research comes back, it's super promising. We hope that. But we recognize that that may be an unrealistic expectation. And so we do expect to fail along the way. And the importance in our failures is that the faster we fail, the faster we've successfully confirmed what not to do. And we can turn our attention to what we need to do. So that concludes the part of my presentation about our carbon removal program. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I may have just altered the rest of your presentation slightly by showing my next slides here. Sorry about that. I didn't realize that I was sharing this screen. So that is a great presentation. Stacy, thank you very much for that. And now we are moving on to the next part, which is on how to purchase these CORCs. And for that, we are going to discuss first the mechanics of the marketplace. So to start with, the suppliers approach us with a claim that they run a carbon net negative business. They back their claim with a evidence that proves that, and once that is verified by the auditor, then we can issue the certificates with which they can then sell at their will. The buyers will meet the suppliers in our marketplace, and if there's a match, the money from the buyers goes, of course, to the suppliers, which will be then used to accelerate their development, be it by reducing their price, doing more marketing, or investing in technology that allows them to remove some bottlenecks. The buyers, of course, will get the access to the certificates, which they then can cancel, and along with that, they will get the full evidence trail on how the cancellation or how the sequestration took place. So there are three ways currently to purchase CORCs, these carbon removal certificates. And we used to have another one called auctions, but those were considered to be too cumbersome, both from the buyer and the seller perspective, so we are not doing them at the moment. However, we have an online store, we have a pre-purchase agreement, and something we call a direct purchase as well. So let's discuss these one after another. The online store is available at Puro.earth/services, and there you can do smaller purchases, let's say up to 10,000 certificates, and that is done in a way that there is no need for the marketplace agreement, and therefore the buyer doesn't have the account where to store them. And instead they will be immediately cancelled. So the cancellation purpose and the beneficiary are defined at the point at the time when the purchase is made. But then again, you get the cancellation statement immediately afterwards. And the payment happens by a corporate credit card or then by invoice, if that is preferred. The second way is to purchase via a pre-purchase agreement, which is basically a good way for the buyer and the seller to agree on not just one, but several transactions now and in the future. Of course, that is beneficial for the buyer to secure availability, and for the supplier, and for both parties, of course, it provides hedging against price volatility. This is a system that requires both parties to have the marketplace agreement signed, which of course is not a big deal. It's a standard agreement, one pager plus a couple of pages of terms and conditions, which are more stringent towards the supplier with all the penalties for breaches and so forth. From the buyer perspective, it's basically just saying that if you get an invoice, you have to pay that. Then the ownership of the certificates are transferred to the buyer, and then you can do, as a buyer, you can do whatever you want with them. You can cancel them, or you could also resell them if that is something that you would want. And the payment in this scenario goes from the buyer directly to the supplier, and we charge our transaction fee from the supplier afterwards. Then the third one is a direct purchase, where it is possible for a buyer to have us create a portfolio where, instead of having to engage with several different suppliers for just one transaction, we will take care of that. And yes, there is the marketplace agreement is required, but then there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how to use them and so forth. Then the payment goes through Puro.earth in this case as well. All right, hopefully that answered some of those questions. Happy to discuss those more in detail, but let's see if there is indeed what Stacy also was calling after this, scalability to megaton scale. And for this, Maren is joining me for this part here. There you go.
Yes, very much agree with Stacy there, and also Microsoft, as they say here, that carbon removal business is something that the world must build now. It's nearly non-existent, very small scratch compared to what we need, and we need to scale it up extremely quickly. But this morning, when I heard the news about the NASA rover landing in Mars, I was really hopeful that, yes, if that can be done, also this can be done.
All right. This is a topic that I've been trying to describe in a way that would be understandable. I'm not sure if this is it, but let's try anyway. So first of all, of course, scaling from our perspective means that we want to onboard all eligible companies, suppliers to our ecosystem, from within the existing methodologies that we have. And then the ones that are in, we need to scale them. So the acceleration effect that was mentioned earlier, so that is then the second dimension over there. And the third dimension is to develop new methodologies. So the market is currently supply constrained, and it does take some time for the supplier candidates to gather the evidence of net negativity before they can join. And on the other hand, it does take some time for the acceleration effect to kick in. And yes, it takes some time for us to develop new methodologies. So therefore, we're doing this all at the same time. So we are growing in 3 dimensions, and therefore hopefully start to cover a larger space very quickly as time passes. At the moment, our supplier funnel is quite, let's say, wide in terms of geographic scope. Here are some examples of our supplier funnel. There are more than 130 companies at the moment, probably close to 150 nowadays already. These are just examples of them, the most sort of mature ones. A lot of activity in Europe, of course, Scandinavia as well, but quite a lot also in North America and Australia. Delightfully many new entrepreneurs and old entrepreneurs developing new ways of sequestering carbon dioxide.
And we are very clear on that there is not one silver bullet. We understand that there are many silver bullets and all of them have to grow. We have made a supply scenario here, a realistic one, a possible one, and it may be that this is not the one that will materialize in 5 years. So in 5 years, we expect to be in megaton scale starting from today. And these are the technologies that you saw in the first slide, the durable long-term methods of removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it. Antti, you are on mute.
All right, very good. All right, so now we are open for questions and comments. Happy to discuss any topics that you might want to share. Anything in the chat, perhaps, Elba?
There was one question about the intermediaries currently participating in our marketplace, and if there is space for them to buy and sell CORCs on behalf of other clients or corporate customers.
Yeah.
And so I can maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. So intermediaries are welcome to the ecosystem. So we've worked together with, for example, South Pole right from the beginning. They were part of the network that created the rules and the first 3 methodologies, and they are, they can purchase certificates on behalf of their customers and then cancel them so that their customers are the beneficiaries, and thus make these CORCs be part of the portfolio that is being offered to the customer. So yes, indeed, that is possible.
Then there's a question by Sierra about ICROA status, which was introduced in the Microsoft publication.
Yeah,
yes,
very good.
I can maybe answer that. We have, they have scrutinized and looked at Puro rules in one technical committee meeting where we received back some additional clarifications that we need to answer to them. And the questions were related to the process of developing new methodologies and governance issues. So that is expected to go to the next technical committee meeting in March, I think it was.
Yeah, and the question also lists that. Why is that? And I think the reason for that is, even though there are a lot of these pioneering companies, such as Microsoft, who are hiring a ton of consultants and experts and whatnot, to truly understand the methodology and make sure that this is a climate service, carbon removal is being done. At the same time, there's still a lot of corporations that maybe they have the smaller sustainability team and a little bit less of resources how to go about it. So at the same time, while we're developing something new, we still kind of see the value in getting an approval from someone like ICROA. You can expand on that if you wish.
No, I think it's fair to say that it makes life of the buyers easier if there is this external accreditation to a standard, for sure. So it is useful. Is there anything else? I actually saw that there's a question about additionality and especially regarding wooden building elements. This is a topic that often gets asked from us, and it's a fair question. So when we started this framework, we of course needed to get some, in order to test whether it works or not, we had to find processes that were already there, something that was there but needed, boosting. And we know that in Finland, for example, 40% of the houses are built from wood or have a wooden frame, but there's a lot of room for growth here as well. And we know that in Central Europe, the same figure is 4%. So there's much more room to grow. So what we're seeing is that since we are not looking at the sort of co-benefits, and we're not looking at the avoided emissions from using wood instead of cement-based materials, but we are just looking at an amount of CO2 that is taken away from the atmosphere. Each ton that is taken away already carries a value. And then when there's the contractual obligation for the supplier to use that money for acceleration of or boosting their business by lowering their price or doing more marketing or removing some obstacles or bottlenecks along the way, that is again valuable for the buyer. And we are actually improving that, so improving visibility to these actions. So for example, right now we are doing a sort of a larger offer for one potential customer where their monetary contribution is actually tied directly into an activity in this wooden elements construction. So the act of purchasing something will result in an auditable activity or result in the production. Hopefully that answers that question sufficiently for now. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of discussion about the Scope 3 emissions earlier. I think Mikael did a good job answering to those. So if there's anything else anyone wants to ask for some opinions on that, then go ahead.
I would actually like to comment to Mikael, and thank you for a good presentation of a difficult topic. You said that on the spend, if the spend, the euros that the company spends are used as a proxy and of emissions, then the only way to reduce is to spend less. And what if you turned the tables around and were able to spend more or spend same or more, but remove at the same time? And I think that was in the hierarchy, your emission reduction hierarchy. You did not show the option of replacing an existing product with carbon removing alternative. And now we are coming very close to the wooden building elements or other building materials made out of biomass type of discussion, that you actually can spend more and remove carbon, and that would be really happy solution for the world.
Yes, thank you, Marianne, for a good question. I think it was probably also a bit reductionistic of me saying that if you use a spend-based approach, you can only reduce by reducing spend. Of course, you can also reallocate your spend to less emitting activities and products, even the CO2 negative products, right? But I just think probably the reason why it often comes down to being not the possibility is that the emission factors you can use to link your spend to emissions are just not that granular. So normally it's using 1,000 euro on electronic equipment, and that's the level of granularity you're able to measure on. So simply it's around, again, that the emission factors are not granular enough to maybe do that kind of, or reflect that you're actually using your money more wisely. And thus you have to go down to not looking at money, but looking at materials. So we are buying wooden building elements instead of steel or whatever. But yeah, good point.
Is Stacy still on the line?
I'm right here.
I have one question for you. What kind of feedback have you guys gotten since the first purchases last year?
We've received a wide range of feedback depending on the audience. We've had some companies want more details on our process. So right now we're working on formalizing a publication that talks through all of the things that I discussed today. The feedback we've received from the 13 companies that we've supported is that it's changed their business. In many cases, we were their first customer. They now have multiple customers, and some of them are orders of magnitude larger in purchase size in terms of tonnage that other companies are now buying from these companies. So what we are noticing is that the demand signal has been received by the carbon removal market, and the supply is starting to come up. So the feedback that we're getting sort of from a lot of our companies is that they have quantities available for sale in 2021. And in order for them to keep moving forward, we really need to try to increase the corporate purchases. So those are the feedback that's coming from our carbon companies. From other corporations, I've had a lot of calls about how we deal with buying carbon removal that may not be certified, or there may not be a methodology. And so I was really happy to be invited to come to this session today, because a lot of the carbon removal solutions that are out there, scientifically, they're very easy to measure. Inputs in equals product out, and it's an irreversible chemical reaction, which from a scientific standpoint is very easy to verify. We just have to have the standards and methodologies catch up. So that's a bit of the feedback and conversation that's happened since we launched. In general, people have wanted to try to find a way to follow the approach that we've taken. That's probably the number one comment. So that's what we're looking to address with our upcoming document that we're going to release.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
All right. Any final questions from the audience? I think there hasn't been really that many new questions. There's been a good conversation going on in the chat. And we are just about to run out of the allocated time. So I think it is time for us to thank everybody for joining. It's been really great to have you all here. We will be sending an email afterwards to all the people who registered to get the presentations and also the recording of this session. So it was a pleasure having you, everybody, here, and hope we'll be able to engage again later on. Thank you, and bye-bye. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.